This is intended to be more of a workshop. It's kind of a takeoff from the field guide. The field guide came about when I was approached by Paradise K, a production company that specializes in these heavy laminated field guides of all different types, especially marine field guides. They're situated out of Arcata, California, Northern California, right there, the doorway to Bigfoot country. And they wanted to do one on Sasquatch, and they approached me about writing it. So it gave me the opportunity to kind of try to distill. You know, it was at a point when I was feeling some frustration with the, and I hate to use the word amateur investigator, I'd rather say that the citizen scientist out there in the field who just wasn't really quite hitting the mark on systematic, reliable documentation of evidence. And so I thought this would be a great opportunity to kind of make some suggestions, give some tips, provide some pointers. And so this is not suggesting that this is going to make you successful in finding that evidence, because I certainly spent a lot of time in the field without any fruits born directly anyway from it. So the first thing is identification, obviously. That blur of fur running between the tree trunks or appearing in the undergrowth or whatever. What is it? How are you going to be sure that what you're seeing is what you think you're seeing? There are other animals out there that can strike an impressive, an imposing pose. Bears' resemblance to humans, their anthropomorphic appearance is very well known, and they play, as a result, an interesting role in lots of folklore, in lots of Native American traditions. If any of you are hunters, if you've ever seen a bear dressed out, its musculoskeletal anatomy has an uncanny resemblance to humans. In fact, we had a case where, again, as was mentioned, we're experiencing some protracted drought conditions. Some of the reservoirs have been drawn down further than they have in decades. And in one reservoir not far from us, a big black garbage bag appeared. And someone opened it up, curious, and there was a stinking, rotting mess in there. And as they looked a little closer, they thought it was the body of a missing person. The coroner then, of course, spread it out, and they cleaned it up, and it was the carcass of a bear, a field-dressed bear that someone hadn't. It was easier to dump it in the reservoir than to take it to the city dump. Anyway, so this upright posture, this vertical appearance, you know, that is in stark contrast to the typical horizontal search image that many hunters cultivate to recognize the back of a quadrupedal animal there amongst the vertical tree trunks. And we'll point out some of the distinguished features. There are other large mammals out there that, under the right circumstances, might be a little misleading. So a moose or a caribou, seen on end, can sometimes strike a pose that gives the impression of an upright figure, given their size and height otherwise, although there clearly are obviously other distinguishing features. So how do we know, how can you distinguish? What are the field marks of how a Sasquatch appears? We've already looked at some of those anatomical characteristics in Patty, in this particular film clip, and then above are some animations that are done by Brendan Bannon, a very good artist who showed us here his interpretation of the figure in the Patterson-Gimlin film. I'm sorry, I hate to is somebody smoking outside? If that's the case by the door, can that door be closed? That's blowing right in through here, and it really, either that or go 20 feet from the door is the rule on our campus. Actually, you can't smoke at all on campus now. Thank you. So here, identification. What are some of the field marks? What are some of those distinguishing characteristics that set the Sasquatch off? Well, when a bear stands up, one of the interesting anatomical features is that, as with most carnivores, they lack collarbones. If you go home and feel on your dog or your cat, there is no clavicle, no collarbone. So bears don't have squared shoulders. They have very sloping shoulders. Obviously, they have a large head and ears poised on top of the head, whereas Sasquatch has ears on the sides of the head, oftentimes frequently obscured by hair, or at least not noticed by witnesses. Their limb proportions are very different, so their crotch appears to be very low. It's like some of these teenagers. This is the Justin Bieber of the forest world. So long legs and long arms. The bear, because of its more quadrupedal shoulder girdle, doesn't reach its arms out to the side much. A bear actually has more shoulder mobility than, say, a wolf would. But so less mobile arms. Usually when they're standing upright, their arms are out in front also to help with balance. So those are some of the distinguishing features. The prominent snout of the bear as seen in profile. The flat face in contrast, so a striking difference that often set witnesses back when they see that flat face instead of a snout of a bear. And then of course, oftentimes with human figures, we're expecting to see some of the stuff. Remember, again, we can't go out in the woods without our stuff. So a hat, a backpack, a walking stick, shorts, socks, and so forth, shoes and boots. So these are some of the characteristics just highlighted there to help with that. Obviously, footprints. Footprints are an important trace evidence. In fact, many mammal species are remarkably reclusive or entirely nocturnal. And much of what we learn about their behavior and their activity patterns is derived from the tracks and traces that are left behind. So footprints are a trove of potential information. So how do we tell the difference? I'm always shown lots and lots of pictures. We don't always have the benefit of a very clear footprint under ideal conditions like this. Sometimes they're much more obscure, much more subtle, and so you have to understand the anatomy in order to interpret those subtleties accurately. The only other animal that really has potential for misidentification out there, consistently, is the bear, which has a hind foot that is relatively flat, plantigrade. Not completely. Bears do rock up a little bit on their heel, which is why the heel of their hind foot is rather tapered. They're not supporting a lot of weight on that calcaneus or heel bone. They do have 5 toes. But now, these are all right feet, casts of right feet. But notice the contrast here. What's different? It looks like the foot's backwards. The inner toe, what would be our big toe, is the shortest toe on a bear track. Their big toe only has 2 phalanges, 2 bones in it. It's kind of like a little thumb. And so it's very short. We have a very long first toe because remember, we came from a primate that was adapted for grass climbing. And that big toe is disproportionately big. And the lateral toes have become much, much shorter to resist bending stresses during walking, during toe off. So the inner toe is the tallest. Now, notice that the hind print is divided by a crease that separates the metatarsal pad, or sometimes called the interdigital pad, and the heel pad back here, or calcaneal pad. And that pad is asymmetric. Think of it looking kind of like a cashew. The thicker edge of it is on the outside. Bears tend to walk kind of pigeon-toed, and so that outer side of the foot has the thicker bit of the pad. Okay? So that should be a giveaway. Now sometimes when bears walk at certain speeds, they actually overstep. Their hind foot crosses where the forepaw has touched down. And so you'll get this kind of a composite. And if it's a bit vague, sometimes it strikes a resemblance of an elongated foot. And then you don't have the clear differentiation between fore and hind paws and the quadrupedal pattern of footfalls, okay, with the alternating hind and fore paws. And so the things to look for are the betraying little toes of the forepaw. But the real giveaway is, notice that the Sasquatch has this exceptionally broad heel adapted for carrying that massive weight. The volume increases with the cube of linear dimensions, but the surface area only with the square. So you have to get much bigger surface for an animal that's so much taller because of the tremendous mass that is accumulated. But the forepaw of the bear looks like a kidney bean, kind of, or another cashew, if you will. And again, the outer pad is the tallest or thickest here, but it has an indentation, a concavity, like the hilum on the bean, the indentation on the bean. And that's a dead giveaway. If you don't have a nice rounded heel, If it's either indented or it's sharply tapered, then it's not a Sasquatch track. And of course, the human is characterized by the longitudinal arch, and it's very distinctive. It's not just a simple raised border. I mean, there is a decided arch and differential enlargement of the, elaboration rather, not enlargement, elaboration of the connective tissue and fatty ball of the foot here underneath that joint at the helical metatarsal phalangeal joint, or the joint at the base of the big toe. So you get this kind of question mark. I mean, there's actually kind of a button hook right there. You get this kind of question mark shape as weight is borne over the ball and along the lateral edge of the foot and over the calcaneal or heel pad of the foot. And then another real telltale sign in human populations, modern shoe-wearing human populations, is that very few shoe makers give us sufficient room for our toes. And so our toes are kind of cramped into a tight space. And they're sort of squashed together. I mean, so much so that if you look, on your little toe, there sometimes is a crease where it's been pressed together. Like if you've ever unpacked a crate of grapes, the grapes have been packed in there for a while, and they come out looking like dice instead of nice round grapes, have sharp little edges. Well, your little toe's like that. In some individuals, so much so that it actually gets twisted and pushed on its side, so that the nail is pointing completely laterally. There was a case in Idaho where a newspaper delivery truck driver claimed he saw a Bigfoot, and that it left a row of tracks across a patchy, snowy plowed field. And he took photographs and a cast was made. Well, if it was Bigfoot, Bigfoot's been wearing cowboy boots, because the toes were just as crunched into a point as you can imagine, the little toe completely on its side. This individual had a hyper arch, a raised arch, so that there was actually a gap all the way across the middle of the foot. Not a mid-tarsal break, but this was a gap, went all the way underneath. Okay, so, the internet is great these days, and there's no reason all of you can't become experts on bear tracks. And that's really the number one thing. You don't have to be an expert on every rodent, every mustelid, if you focus your attention on hair and tracks and scat of these animals that are of approximately the same body mass. The only other one to take some cursory look at would be something like an elk. There was a gentleman down in Utah who was just convinced he had three-toed tracks. I said, I've never seen a realistic, a reliable, credible three-toed track. And he showed me his photograph of one. He said he followed this thing for miles. 3 toes. It was his footprint, and it was overlapping elk tracks. And the lobe on the back of the hoof is nice and rounded. So if you have them overlapping, you can get a series of what look like little rounded stubby toes. And our eyes become so attuned to that search image of seeing toes. If you remember back, one of the few Finding Bigfoot episodes I saw was a very early one when they found a footprint. A bear hunter had found the footprint supposedly, and they were all excited about it. And Matt's on the phone saying, "Are there toes? Are there toes?" It turned out they sent me that cast. It was kind of embarrassing because Cliff is a great guy and a really good relationship. We share information all the time. He got really excited. He unfortunately made a statement these were the best tracks he'd ever seen. Well, they were the best bear tracks he'd ever seen, maybe, but they were bear. It was an overlapping bear print, and they didn't send them to me soon enough to follow up in that episode. They did ask me to write up an analysis for a follow-up, but given the nature of the analysis, they just didn't. Let sleeping dogs lie. But you should become an expert. I mean, there's so many great pictures of bear tracks of all different qualities and sizes and shapes and species, black bear and brown bear, that you should create an archive, create a digital archive on your laptop. Quiz yourself, look at it, become familiar, look at those distinguishing characteristics. There was a very prominent researcher who published a photograph in his newsletter of a possible Bigfoot track from Montana. And it was one of the perfect examples. I mean, I could have used it in this figure right here instead of this one. It looked just like that. And it was a grizzly bear, a Montana grizzly bear. It was pretty good sized. And I contacted the witness and he said, "Oh, don't use Don't use that. He said, after I talked to this guy who didn't know what he was talking about, he said, I went to one of the fish and game people, and they showed me it was a grizzly bear track. And I said, I know, I wanted to ask you if I can use it as an example of such. And I left him unnamed, no, but his initials are no. So, and they're also great photos. I mean, it helps to understand the anatomy of what you're looking at. Because every once in a while, for example, this ulnar pad shows up, especially in the brown bears, where they have more weight, and they're not up on the ends of their digits so much, on the forepaw. They're pressed down because of the weight even more, so you'll get that extra pad back here. But you can see the proportions of that pad, that disproportionate shape. Wider on the outside, narrower on the inside. You can see the narrow heel pad here. Okay? And another telltale sign that often shows up is especially with brown bears, is that they'll have tufts of hair between the toes that may show up if it's in muddy conditions. And not to mention, you notice I haven't mentioned the claws. Obviously, if claws are present and obvious, that's a giveaway. The absence of claws is not evidence of it not being a bear. Especially black bears will dig, in grizzly bears too. Their front claws are extremely long, so it takes a lot of digging to wear them down to where they don't show up. But black bears can wear them right down to the quick. And I've had lots and lots of tracks where there is no indication of claws whatsoever. And I've had lots of arguments with supposedly experienced hunters that say, oh yeah, the bears always show claws on their tracks. No, they don't. And I've got lots of examples in the laboratory. Now, when the brown bears get exceptionally big and heavy, sometimes that crease isn't so obvious. And the the contour of the heel end of the hind paw is much more full and rounded as more weight rests back on that heel bone and that pad becomes expanded to take up that weight. Okay, but then again, the quadrupedal pattern. All right, so Sasquatch footprints have very distinctive characteristics of breadth to length. If someone reports to you dimensions where the width exceeds, what I was going to say, is more than 50. That's what I was going to say. More than 50% of the length, then you should question it. Because all credible cases, the breadth is, and I don't have this was kind of on the spur of the moment, so I'm shooting from the hip here. But the breadth, so for example, Patty's tracks were 14.5 to 15 inches by 5 inches in width. Okay? And that proportionality is pretty equal. Now, their foot has, since it has not experienced the constraint of shoe wear, just as if we were to go and measure, as has been done by some of the early ethnographers and physical anthropologists, measure the mobility of the feet of native populations that have never worn shoes, has a much greater range of splay. Our metatarsals are bound together by a strong ligament that prevents them from spreading too far, but feet that are much more mobile, that have never experienced the confinement of shoes, have a much greater range. And we see this with Sasquatch tracks. So in some instances, sometimes even the same trackway, you'll see a much narrower track and then a much broader one, especially if the conditions change. If it's going up an incline, for example, or if it's slipping in the mud, and so on. All right, so always take a scale with you. Now notice this person, for example, he thought it was sufficient to put his foot next to the track. Well, how do I know if this person is as tall as Jim, for example? Jim's still here? Well, that's no fun. Or if he's as tall as me, you can't base that. He would have been much better to at least put something like a dollar bill, something of standard, easily accessible scale. Or better yet, just get a little scale. You can actually make them on your computer and print them out, or you can download scales. There he is. You can print them out on your computer and just make disposable ones that you don't have to worry about losing them. That's what I do, and just stick them in your camera case and then put that down there. Or just roll up a little seamstress cloth tape to get it out of there. All right, the consistency is remarkable. It really is remarkable. I mean, in my mind, if these are all spurious hoaxes, Who's been passing out the little black book with the instruction manual on all of the important critical features to